The emerald silk of the gown was a beautiful lie. It whispered of wealth, of belonging, of a grace that Elara Vance felt had been scraped from her soul years ago. To the other guests drifting through the grand ballroom of the Obsidian, a space of soaring black marble and constellations of crystal, she was a perfect portrait, an elegant accessory on the arm of Marcus Thorne, a man whose smile was a carefully negotiated contract. But inside the lie, Elara was suffocating. The air, thick with the scent of hothouse lilies and expensive perfume, felt thin in her lungs. Each polite nod, each murmured pleasantry was a small death. She was an architect of silence and endurance, building walls inside herself that no one could see. Her mother, Beatrice, materialized at her side, her presence a sudden drop in temperature. Beatrice's own gown was the color of dried blood, a warning. Her smile was a masterpiece of social engineering, warm at the edges, but glacial at its core. She did not look at Elara, she assessed her, a jeweler inspecting a flawed stone. "You're holding your glass wrong," Beatrice murmured, her voice a silken threat meant only for Elara. "It leaves condensation." "It's common," Elara corrected her grip, her fingers stiff. It was always something, her posture, her gaze, the cadence of her speech. 1,000 tiny failures that only her mother could perceive and catalog. Marcus, oblivious or simply indifferent, was deep in a loud performative conversation about leveraged buyouts, with a man whose face was a mask of bored sycophancy. He was her mother's choice, a suitable merger of assets and ambition. Chess. He had not updated the file on Elara. He was working from a version of her that her mother had written, a version that had never been accurate. "Marcus is closing the Henderson deal tomorrow," Beatrice continued, her eyes scanning the crowd, hunting for bigger predators, more valuable connections. "It will be a significant victory for the firm. You will be expected to be appropriately appreciative." "I am always appropriate," Elara said, the words tasting like ash. That was the wrong answer. Beatrice's smile tightened by a millimeter, a seismic shift that only Elara could interpret. Appropriate is the bare minimum. It is the territory of hired help. You are to be ecstatic. You are to be the living embodiment of his success. Is that understood? Elara thought about the blueprints hidden in a locked folder on her personal laptop. Designs for buildings that breathed, that caught the light in ways that made stone and steel feel alive. She thought about the credit for the very building they were standing in, the Obsidian, a triumph of cantilevered glass and daring structure. Her design, her late nights, her genius, all of it signed away, credited to the senior partners at Vance Sterling Architecture. Her family's firm, her inheritance, which had become her prison. "I need some air," Elara said, her voice a low, steady thing. A controlled tremor. She began to turn, a simple, graceful pivot away from the suffocation. But Beatrice's fingers, surprisingly strong, clamped onto her arm. The grip was not just restraining, it was proprietary. "You will go nowhere," Beatrice hissed, the smile never leaving her face. A ventriloquist of cruelty. "You will stand here and you will adorn Marcus's victory. That is your function. Let go of me," Elara said, not loudly, but with a clarity that cut through the cloying air between them. For a flicker of a second, Beatrice's mask slipped. Naked rage flashed in her eyes. "You ungrateful little fool! Do you have any idea what I have sacrificed to give you this life, this position? And you would throw it all away for a moment of petulance." The accusation was so old, so worn, it was almost comfortable in its familiarity. But tonight, it felt different. The beautiful lie of the gown was tearing at the seams. "What life?" Elara asked, her voice still quiet, but the foundations of her internal walls were beginning to crack. "The one where I am a showpiece, where my work is stolen and my name is erased. I am not an adornment, mother. I am an architect." Beatrice laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was sharp and brittle, like ice shattering. "You are a draftsman. A talented one, I'll grant you, but you lack the constitution for this world. You are too fragile. Too much." She leaned in closer, her perfume a cloying wave of tuberose and malice. "You think you can survive out there on your own? Don't be absurd. No one will ever want you. Not for your mind, not for your name. Without me, without Marcus, you are nothing. A pretty, hollow thing that will be used up and discarded. Do you hear me, Elara? No one will ever want you." The words landed like stones, not because they were new, but because, for the first time, Elara felt the full, crushing weight of their intent. They were meant to be the final bricks in her prison wall. Marcus, sensing a shift in the current, ended his conversation and swaggered over. He saw the tension, the white-knuckle grip Beatrice had on Elara's arm, and he misinterpreted it completely. He saw a petulant woman needing a firm hand. "Everything all right here, darling?" he asked, his tone indulgent. He placed his hand over Beatrice's, doubling the pressure on Elara's arm. "Don't mind her," he said to Beatrice, winking. "She gets these moods. Nothing, a little champagne and a reminder of her obligations can't fix." He tugged her arm, a gesture of ownership, of casual dismissal, and in that moment something inside Elara broke, not with a crash, but with a clean, silent snap. The architect of endurance had finally designed her own exit. She did not scream. She did not struggle. She simply looked past her mother, past her fiancé, her gaze landing on a point in the glittering crowd. The walls were gone. She was hollowed out, but the space that remained was, for the first time, entirely her own. "Let go of my arm," she said again. Her voice was different now. It was not pleading. It was not demanding. It was a statement of fact, the kind of silence that doesn't echo, the kind that settles. Marcus chuckled, a sound full of arrogant confidence. "Now, Elara, don't make a scene." But a scene had already been made. A scene had been playing for 28 years. This was merely the final act, and it seemed they had an audience. A man was approaching. He was not rushing. He was not performing. He moved through the opulent chaos of the gala with an unhurried precision. A predator moving through a forest where all the other animals knew, instinctively, to be still. He wore a charcoal suit tailored with mathematical perfection. His presence was not loud, it was dense, it had gravity. As he drew nearer, conversations around them seemed to thin out, the ambient chatter lowering in deference to a silence he carried with him. He stopped a few feet away. He did not look at Beatrice. He did not look at Marcus. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, were fixed on Elara. And in his gaze, she saw something she had never seen before. Recognition. He was not looking at a flawless portrait or a flawed stone. He was looking at the architect. Julian Thorne, the host of the gala, the man whose name was whispered with a mixture of terror and reverence in every boardroom in the city, tilted his head slightly. His voice, when he spoke, was low and calm. Yet it carried with absolute authority. It sliced through the tension like a scalpel. "You are touching my fiancé's arm." The statement was so outrageous, so profoundly impossible, that for a full second, no one moved. Beatrice's perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat. Marcus's face, which had been a canvas of smug possession, became a mess of confusion and disbelief. He looked from Julian to Elara and back again, his brain failing to process the new data. Your fiancé?" Marcus stammered, his grip on Elara's arm finally faltering. It was not a question. It was a system error. Julian's gaze did not waver from Elara's. There was a question in his eyes, a silent offer. "Play along. I will handle this." It was a risk, a leap into a greater unknown than the one she had been facing moments before. But the prison her mother had built was suddenly intolerable. The familiar cage was more terrifying than the strange, quiet power of the man in front of her. She gave a barely perceptible nod. That was all he needed. Julian's attention shifted, and for the first time he looked directly at Marcus. The full, undivided weight of his focus was a physical force. Marcus flinched, his hand dropping from Elara's arm as if it had been burned. "Yes," Julian said, the word as cold and final as a closing vault door. "My fiancé. And you and her mother seem to be causing her some distress." He took a step forward, closing the space. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The power he projected was structural, not decorative. "I suggest you both leave." Quote. Now Beatrice, recovering her wits, tried to deploy her most potent weapon, social indignation. "How dare you? This is my daughter. We were having a private family discussion." "Your discussion," Julian replied, his voice steady as iron wrapped in silk, "became my business the moment you laid hands on her." He glanced at a man in a simple black suit who had appeared silently at his shoulder. The man had not been there a second ago, and yet he seemed to have been there all along. "Daniel, please escort Mr. Thorne and Mrs. Vance out. Their invitations have been revoked." That's not Marcus Thorne," Beatrice sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at Marcus. "He's Marcus Thorne." Julian allowed a flicker of something that might have been amusement or perhaps pity to cross his face. "A temporary confusion, I'm sure. One that will be rectified in the morning." He looked at Marcus, his expression flat. "You should have read the acquisition prospectus more carefully. The company name was part of the deal." The color drained from Marcus's face. The Henderson deal. The victory he was meant to be celebrating. It clicked into place with the sickening sound of a guillotine dropping. He had been acquired, erased. His name, his company, his future, all of it now belonged to the quiet, immovable man standing before him. Daniel and another security guard, equally silent and efficient, moved in. They did not touch Beatrice or Marcus. They simply flanked them, their presence an undeniable command. There was no argument, there was no scene. There was only the quiet, humiliating retreat as the crowd parted before them, their whispers following them out of the grand ballroom like a funeral dirge. The space they left behind was filled with a profound silence. Julian Thorne turned back to Elara. The storm in his eyes had softened to a low, steady calm. He held out his hand, palm up. It was not a demand, it was an invitation. An offer of safe passage. "Elara," he said, her name on his lips sounding like a destination. "Shall we?" She looked at his outstretched hand, at the man who had just dismantled her entire world in under 2 minutes with a few quiet words. He had lied for her. He had created a fiction to save her from a reality that had been crushing her. She did not know why. She did not know him. But as she placed her trembling hand in his, she knew, with an architect's certainty, that this was the first honest structure she had been offered in her entire life. His grip was firm, warm, and blessedly, heartbreakingly gentle. He was not holding her, he was steadying her. And as he led her away from the staring eyes and the dying music, she felt the beautiful, suffocating lie of the emerald gown fall away, leaving only the woman who had, against all odds, survived. Julian led her not back into the throng, but through a discreet door concealed in the marble paneling. It opened onto a silent, carpeted corridor, the opulent noise of the gala instantly muted. The transition was surreal, like stepping out of a storm into a soundproof room. The only sound was the soft whisper of her silk gown against the floor. He did not speak. He simply walked beside her, his presence a shield against the world she had just left behind. The corridor ended at a private elevator, which ascended with a smooth, silent hum. The doors opened directly into a sprawling penthouse apartment that occupied the entire top floor of the Obsidian. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the breathtaking panorama of the city, glittering tapestry of light and ambition laid out below. It was a view from the heavens, a perspective of absolute power. He led her to a pair of deep leather armchairs near the window, gestured for her to sit. He moved to a small immaculate bar and poured 2 glasses of water, the clink of the ice, the only sound in the vast, quiet space. "Wine." He handed one to her, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting, electric moment. "Thank you," she said, her voice raspy. She took a sip, the cold water a shock to her system. He sat in the chair opposite her, not too close, granting her a respectful distance. He did not press her. He did not ask if she was all right. The question was absurd. He simply waited, giving the silence the room it needed to breathe. The silence in the apartment was not an absence of sound, but a presence, a foundation. It was the kind of silence she had craved for years, a space where she could hear her own thoughts. Finally, she found her voice again. "Why did you do that?" Julian Thorne looked at her, his expression unreadable but intent. "Because I do not tolerate bullies, and because they were wrong." "Wrong about what?" she whispered. "About you," he said simply. "They look at you and see an asset, a decoration." "What? They are visually impaired." She felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat, but she swallowed it down. "You called me your fiancé. It was the most efficient way to establish an unassailable claim and terminate their harassment," he stated, as if describing a line of code. "It can be rescinded at any time, should you wish." The cold corporate language was strangely comforting. He was not playing a romantic game. He was solving a problem, her problem. And Marcus? His company. Thorne Industries acquired his parent company, Sterling, FinTech, this afternoon. The final paperwork was signed an hour before the gala began. He was celebrating a victory that had belonged to me for several hours. He simply hadn't received the memorandum. There was no triumph in his voice. It was a simple statement of fact. Business. Clean, ruthless, and utterly final. Elara stared at him, trying to piece together the impossible puzzle he represented. This man, who commanded skylines and dismantled corporations as a matter of course, had intervened for her, a woman he did not know. "But you don't know me," she said, the words a fragile protest. His lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "That is where you are mistaken, Miss Vance. I know you are the one who truly designed this building." He gestured with his glass to the sprawling city beyond the window. "I know you solved the torsional stress problem on the spire with a counterweighted dampening system based on the skeletal structure of a bird's wing. An idea so elegant and audacious that the review committee at Vance Sterling dismissed it as unfeasible before your uncle, the firm's senior partner, presented it as his own 6 months later." Elara felt the air leave her lungs. It was a secret she had buried deep. A piece of her own genius she had been forced to disown. A wound she thought no one had ever seen. "How? How could you know that?" "I was one of the judges for the Kellerman Prize for Architectural Innovation at your university 7 years ago," he explained, his voice a low, steady cadence. "You submitted your preliminary thesis on biomimetic structural engineering. Your portfolio was revolutionary. You should have won a last-minute substitution by your university's dean gave the prize to a far less imaginative but better-connected student. I never forgot your work." He paused, letting the information settle. "When my company decided to build a new global headquarters, we solicited designs. Vance Sterling submitted a portfolio. It was competent but uninspired. Except for one unsigned sketch at the very back, a concept for a residential tower that used light and air as primary structural components, it was brilliant. It was unmistakably yours. So, I started to look into Vance Sterling. I found a pattern, a trail of brilliant anonymous design solutions that kept the firm afloat, all leading back to a junior architect who was never given public credit, you." He had not just seen her tonight. He had been seeing her for years. He had recognized her signature, her intellectual fingerprint, in the work her family had tried so hard to erase it from. The validation was so profound, so unexpected, it felt like a physical blow. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, hot and sharp. She refused to let them fall. She had shed enough tears in the dark. "So you bought my family's company," she said, the scale of it still difficult to comprehend, "because of a student competition and an unsigned sketch?" "I bought a distressed asset with an undervalued and mismanaged genius at its core," he corrected gently. "It was a sound investment. The most valuable part of that company is you, Lara, and they had no idea what you were worth." He stood up and walked over to a large, minimalist desk, picking up a slim, silver laptop. He brought it over and set it on the glass table between them, turning it to face her. On the screen was a pristine, empty digital drafting board. "Your employment contract with Vance Sterling is terminated, effective immediately. Your non-compete clauses are null and void, as I now own the entity that held them." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze direct and serious. I am offering you a new position, head of the new architectural division at Thorne Industries. You will have your own team, an unlimited budget, and complete creative autonomy. Your first project," he gestured to the blank screen, "is to design our new European headquarters in Lisbon. The land has already been acquired." It was not an offer of protection, it was an offer of empowerment. He was not giving her a shield, he was handing her a sword, a drafting pen. He was giving her back her own life, a life she had been convinced was lost to her forever. "Aye." She struggled for words, her mind reeling from the velocity of the change, from prisoner to queen in the space of an hour. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything tonight," he said. "For now, this is your home. The guest wing is yours for as long as you need it. No one will bother you. My staff is discreet. Your mother and Marcus will not be able to contact you." He said the name Marcus with a slight distaste, as if it were a foreign object in his mouth. "Rest, and tomorrow, if you choose, you can begin to build." He stood to leave, to give her the space he had promised, but she found herself speaking, the words coming from a place of long dormant strength. "I don't leave because things become complicated," she said, her voice clearer now. It was a line she had heard him use in a televised interview once, a statement of his own philosophy. He paused, turning back to her. A flicker of deep respect warmed his eyes. "I know," he said. And in that moment, she understood. He wasn't saving a damsel. He was hiring the best person for the job. Nallering. He had simply cleared away the obstacles that were preventing her from doing her work. The arrangement was not charity. It was a partnership. He left her then, and she sat alone in the vast silent penthouse, the city lights glittering below like a fallen galaxy. For the first time in a decade, the suffocating weight on her chest was gone. In its place was a terrifying, exhilarating emptiness, a blank page, a foundation cleared and ready for a new design. She looked at the laptop screen, at the infinite possibility of the empty drafting board. And for the first time in a very, very long time, Elara Vance began to draw. The first week was a study in disorientation. Elara woke each morning in a bed larger than her old apartment's living room. The sheets of thread count so high they felt like cool water against her skin. The silence of the penthouse was the most jarring element. At her mother's house, and later in the sterile apartment Marcus had provided, silence was never empty. It was charged with expectation, with unspoken criticism, with the threat of an impending argument. It was the pause before the storm. Here, the silence was a resource. It was a vast open space, a canvas. The kind of silence that doesn't just quiet the world, but also the noise inside one's own head. Julian Thorne was a ghost in his own home. He left before she woke, and often returned long after she had fallen asleep over her sketches, yet his presence was everywhere. A fresh pot of coffee was always waiting for her in the morning, exactly how she liked it, black, strong. A detail he must have observed that first night. A curated selection of architecture books would appear on the table in her workspace, volumes on Portuguese modernism or sustainable materials. There were no notes, just the quiet, steady provision of tools she needed to do her work. He was not hovering, he was equipping. She threw herself into the Lisbon project with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. It was more than a job, it was a reclamation. Every line she drew, every calculation she made, was an act of defiance against her mother's suffocating narrative. Beatrice had called her fragile, a hollow thing. But on the digital page, Elara was a master of load-bearing walls and seismic bracing. She built structures of immense strength and impossible grace. She was not fragile. She was foundational. They fell into a quiet rhythm. Some nights he would return earlier, finding her still at the massive drafting table he'd had installed in the main living area, the glow of the screen illuminating her focused expression. He would not interrupt. He would pour himself a drink and sit in one of the leather armchairs watching her work. He watched her the way a master craftsman might watch a protégé, with a deep, appreciative understanding of the process. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the gala, he spoke from the shadows. "You're struggling with the atrium." She started, pulling back from the screen. She had been wrestling with it for days, a vast central space that was meant to be the heart of the building, but it felt cold, cavernous, dead. "It's a problem of scale," she admitted, rubbing her tired eyes. "The space needs to feel grand, but also human. Right now, it just feels empty." He rose and came to stand behind her, looking over her shoulder at the 3D model on the screen. He smelled of cold night air and expensive wool. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, a steady, grounding presence. "You're thinking of it as a void to be filled," he said, his voice a low murmur near her ear. "Think of it as a conduit, not for people, but for light. What if the structure itself was a series of overlapping lenses? What if the building's purpose was to draw the Lisbon sun down to its lowest level and fracture it into art?" He didn't tell her what to do. He offered a new question. He recalibrated her perspective. She looked at her design, and suddenly she saw it. Not a void, but a vessel. A cathedral for light. The solution was immediate, brilliant, and entirely her own, sparked by the flint of his observation. "Thank you," she said softly, her fingers already flying across the keyboard, modifying the design, her mind alight with the new possibility. "You already had the answer," he replied, his voice laced with that same faint, rare smile she was beginning to recognize. "You just needed a different question." He retreated to his chair, and they worked in companionable silence for hours. This became their routine, a slow burn of mutual respect built over blueprints and quiet conversations. He never mentioned her mother or Marcus. He never alluded to the rescue at the gala. He treated her not as a survivor he had saved, but as a brilliant colleague he had hired. The respect was more healing than any apology or reassurance could ever have been. It allowed her to redefine herself on her own terms. She began to feel the sharp edges of her trauma softening. The constant low-grade hum of anxiety that had been the soundtrack to her life was fading, replaced by the quiet confidence of her own competence. She started sleeping through the night. She found herself smiling at the way the morning light hit the steel canyons of the city. She was building a new internal architecture, one designed to let the light in. Julian, for his part, was engaged in a different kind of demolition. His assistant, a terrifyingly efficient woman named Evelyn, would sometimes meet him in the penthouse foyer for brief coded updates. Elara, working nearby, would catch snippets. "Vance Sterling's credit lines have been frozen, Mr. Thorne. The board has been replaced. Your nominees were all confirmed. Marcus Thorne's personal assets are leveraged against 3 separate loans we acquired from Deutsche Bank. He is in default." Julian would listen, nod, and issue a few quiet commands. "Initiate foreclosure proceedings. Begin the full forensic audit. Inform the SEC of our findings regarding their accounting irregularities." He was not acting out of anger or revenge. It was a dispassionate, systematic dismantling of a corrupt and inefficient structure. He was clearing a condemned site before beginning new construction. He was tidy, he was thorough, and he was utterly ruthless. Then, he was removing the rot not just to punish it, but to ensure it could never again threaten a valuable asset. To ensure it could never threaten her. The contrast between his quiet, devastating power and her mother's loud, hollow tyranny was stark. Beatrice performed power. Julian possessed it. It was in the very bedrock of his being. One afternoon, a courier delivered a large flat box for Elara. Inside was a simple, architecturally precise dress in a shade of deep charcoal gray. There was a note. Not in Julian's handwriting, but in Evelyn's crisp, perfect script. "Mr. Thorne requests your presence at the groundbreaking ceremony for the Phoenix Tower, tomorrow, 10 a.m. The Phoenix Tower. And the first project she had designed for him, a residential skyscraper that had been fast-tracked with astonishing speed. Her first credited work. Her name was on the press release. Her name was on the invitations. Her name was on the sign that would be unveiled at the construction site. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. A public event, a high-profile stage. It was a perfect target. She knew her mother. Beatrice would not accept defeat quietly. She would see this as a public betrayal, an unforgivable act of defiance. Beatrice did not retreat. She scorched the earth. She found Julian that evening, standing by the vast windows, looking down at the city he owned. "She will be there tomorrow," Elara said, her voice tight. It was not a question. He turned to face her. His expression was calm, reassuring. "Yes, I expect she will. You're not concerned?" "I am prepared," he corrected. "There is a difference. I would not ask you to stand on a stage that was not entirely secure." He took a step closer. "Elara, you have spent your entire life making yourself small to accommodate their fragility. Tomorrow, you will simply stand in the space you have earned. I will handle the rest." "I'm not afraid," she lied. He saw through it instantly, but he did not call her on it. Instead, he gave her the truth. "I know, but you don't have to be brave. Alone anymore." The words landed in the quiet space between them, building a connection stronger than steel. It was the moment she realized the foundation between them was not just professional respect. It was something deeper, something that felt terrifyingly like trust, like safety, like home. The air at the construction site was crisp and cool, smelling of damp earth and diesel. A large stage had been erected, backed by a massive vinyl banner showing a rendering of the Phoenix Tower, its glass facade catching the light of an imaginary sun. The Phoenix Tower. Lead architect, Elara Vance. Seeing her name printed in letters 3 feet high was a dizzying, terrifying thrill. Elara stood beside Julian on the dais, the charcoal dress feeling like a suit of armor. A crowd of city officials, investors, and journalists had gathered. She felt their eyes on her, a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. She was the unknown variable, the mysterious new talent Julian Thorne had plucked from obscurity. She kept her posture straight, her expression neutral, channeling the quiet stillness she had learned from him. She saw them before they made their move. Her mother and Marcus, pushing through the crowd with a shared, desperate urgency. They looked diminished. Beatrice's expensive suit seemed to hang off her, her face a rictus of fury. Marcus looked haunted, his usual swagger replaced by a frantic, hunted energy. They were not here to negotiate. They were here to detonate. They broke through the polite perimeter of the event staff and marched directly toward the stage. Security started to move, but Julian gave a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Let them come. He had anticipated this. He had planned for it. This was not an interruption. This was part of the program. Elara. Beatrice's voice was a shrill shriek that cut through the polite murmur of the crowd. All heads turned. The trap was sprung. How could you? After everything we have done for you. Marcus was right behind her, waving a sheaf of papers in his hand like a weapon. "She's a thief!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "She stole these designs. Intellectual property of Vance Sterling Architecture. We have a contract. We're filing a lawsuit." They stormed up the short set of stairs to the stage, a tableau of righteous indignation. Beatrice grabbed for Elara's arm, a reflexive act of control. "You have an obligation to your family, to the firm that made you." Elara flinched, but she did not pull away. She stood her ground. Beside her, Julian was a pillar of absolute calm. He had not moved a muscle. He simply watched them, his expression one of mild, clinical interest. He let their accusations hang in the air, letting the poison of their desperation fill the silence. The media, smelling blood, surged forward, cameras flashing, microphones extended. When they had finally exhausted their initial volley of rage, Julian stepped forward and took the microphone from its stand. The feedback gave a low squeal before settling. His voice, when he spoke, was not angry. It was perfectly calm, perfectly clear, amplified to reach every corner of the stunned audience. "Good morning," he began, as if opening a routine board meeting. "Thank you all for coming. It seems we have a small administrative matter to clear up before the main presentation." He turned his gaze to Marcus, who was still brandishing the legal papers. "Mr. Thorne," Julian said, the name dripping with irony. "You mentioned a lawsuit being filed by Vance Sterling Architecture for the theft of intellectual property." "That's right," Marcus snarled. "These designs are ours. She is in breach of her employment contract." "An interesting legal theory," Julian mused, his voice dangerously soft. particularly since, as of 3 weeks ago, Thorne Industries completed a full acquisition of Vance Sterling's parent corporation, including all its assets, liabilities, its intellectual property. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Beatrice's face went slack with shock. She had not known. She had been so consumed by her rage at Elara, she had failed to see the corporate guillotine hanging over her own head. Julian continued, his tone relentlessly placid. As the sole owner of Vance Sterling, I can assure you that we will not be filing a lawsuit against our own head of architecture. In fact, we are quite pleased with her work. He gestured to the rendering of the tower behind him. He then turned his cool, analytical gaze on Beatrice. You spoke of obligation. The only obligation I am aware of is the mountain of debt Vance Sterling accrued under your family's mismanagement. Debt which I'm afraid is now owed to me. He also conducted a preliminary audit. He paused, letting the words sink in. The findings regarding certain undocumented partner withdrawals and creative expense reports over the last decade are fascinating. The SEC will certainly think so. Beatrice's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The color had drained from her face, leaving a mask of gray, waxy shock. The foundation of her world, the money and status she had worshipped and wielded as a weapon, had just been vaporized. Ben. Finally, Julian addressed Marcus again. As for your contract, he pulled a slim tablet from his inside jacket pocket and touched the screen. My legal team has been reviewing it. It is a predatory and frankly unenforceable document designed to suppress a unique talent for the benefit of less competent superiors. But, for the sake of argument, let's say it was valid. He looked directly at Marcus, his eyes devoid of any emotion. As the new owner of the company, I am terminating your fiancé's contract and yours. Security will escort you from the premises. He did not say my fiancé. He said your fiancé. He was severing the last illegitimate claim Marcus had on her, publicly and irrevocably. The downfall was absolute. It was swift. It was silent. Marcus stared at the tablet in Julian's hand as if it were a death sentence. The papers he was holding slipped from his numb fingers and scattered across the stage at his feet. His entire reality had been dismantled in less than 90 seconds. He made a strange guttural sound and his knees buckled. He dropped to the stage, a puppet with its strings cut, sobbing uncontrollably. Beatrice stood frozen for a moment longer, her mind refusing to accept the totality of her ruin. Then, the mask of the powerful matriarch finally crumbled into dust, revealing the terrified, hollow woman beneath. She looked at Elara, her eyes wide, with a dawning horror that was almost pitiable. She had not just lost her company. She had not just lost her status. She had lost her daughter, the one she had tried so hard to break, and in doing so, she had broken herself. The security team, Daniel among them, moved onto the stage. They were gentle, professional. They helped Marcus to his feet and put a steadying hand on Beatrice's elbow. They led them away, not like criminals, but like ghosts, being escorted from the world of the living. The crowd parted for them in a stunned, morbid silence. Their social and financial execution was complete. Julian Thorne watched them go, his expression unchanged. When they were gone, he turned back to the microphone, his composure absolute. He had not raised his voice. He had not gloated. He had simply stated the facts. He had presented the closing arguments of a case that had been settled long before the trial ever began. He looked at Elara, and in his eyes, she saw, not pity, but a deep, affirming respect. He had not done this for her. He had done this with her. He had created the conditions for her truth to be heard. He then turned back to the audience. My apologies for the interruption. His voice was calm, steady, pulling the focus of the entire crowd back to the purpose of the day. He gestured toward Elara, a formal, respectful presentation. It is a common practice in my industry to put my own name on the buildings I finance, he said, his amplified voice washing over the silent crowd. But today, that tradition ends. The name Thorne is synonymous with acquisition, with finance, with power. But architecture is about creation. It is about vision. And the vision for this project was not mine. He looked at Elara, his expression softening into something warm and genuine. He was not looking at an employee or an asset. He was looking at his partner. It is my distinct honor to introduce the woman whose brilliance will reshape this city's skyline. The mind that conceived of this structure, the artist who dreamt it into being, and the leader who will oversee its construction from this day forward. Ladies and gentlemen, the lead architect of the Phoenix Tower, Miss Elara Vance. He stepped back, turning the stage, the microphone, the moment entirely over to her. A tentative ripple of applause started, then swelled into a genuine, thunderous ovation. The reporters were no longer looking for a scandal. They were looking at the birth of a star. They were looking at her, really looking at her. And for the first time they were seeing the architect. They were seeing her truth. Elara stepped forward into the full morning sunlight, the warmth on her face feeling like a benediction. The fear was gone, burned away in the crucible of the last 5 minutes. All that was left was a profound, quiet calm. She looked out over the crowd, over the city that stretched to the horizon, and she felt the weight of her past, the ghost of her mother's words. No one will ever want you lift from her shoulders and dissipate into the bright, clear air. Beatrice had been wrong. Julian had not just wanted her, he had seen her, and now, so would the rest of the world. That evening, the penthouse was quieter than ever. The silence was not empty. It was full of the day's echoes, of words said and unsaid. Elara stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights a familiar, comforting constellation below. She was still wearing the charcoal dress, but it no longer felt like armor. It felt like her own skin. She traced the path of a distant aeroplane, a tiny spark of light moving with purpose across the velvet darkness. She felt like that light, small perhaps against the vastness, but finally on her own trajectory. She heard Julian approach his footsteps, silent on the thick rug. Quote, he came to stand beside her, not touching, but his presence was a warmth that filled the space between them. And for a long time they just stood together, watching the ceaseless, silent flow of the city. The board approved the Lisbon preliminary designs this afternoon, he said, his voice a low rumble. Unanimously. They called them visionary. Elara smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips. You own the board. I do, he admitted, a hint of amusement in his tone. But they are not sycophants. They are the best in their fields. They know genius when they see it. I simply made sure they were in the room to look. She turned her head to look at him. In the dim light of the apartment, his face was all sharp angles and shadows, but his eyes were clear, steady. Everything you do is so precise, she said, calculated. The gala, the acquisition. Today, you planned for all of it. I do not like variables. I cannot control, he confirmed. Your mother and Marcus were a variable. They were inefficient. They produced chaos. I removed them. Just like that. Just like that, she thought of the raw, exposed pain on her mother's face, the utter collapse of Marcus's world. She felt a surprising lack of triumph. Not pity, either. Just a quiet, settled sense of finality. A chapter closed. A foundation cleared. Thank you, she said, the words simple, but holding the weight of everything. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for giving me back my own name. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. I did not give you anything, Elara, that you had not already earned. I simply cleared your accounts. He took a small step closer, and the space between them became charged. Electric. The professional respect that had defined their relationship was shifting, settling into something more personal, more profound. That first night, he said, his voice softer now. At the gala, I called you my fiancé. It was a strategy. That a lie used to build a temporary defense. She nodded, her heart starting to beat a little faster. I know. I find, he continued, his gaze unwavering, that I am not comfortable with that particular lie anymore. Not because it was a lie, but because it feels insufficient. He paused, and for the first time since she had met him, Julian Thorne seemed to be searching for the right words. He was a man who moved markets and dismantled empires with a single sentence. But now, he seemed uncertain. Uncertain. It was the most human she had ever seen him. "I would like to replace the strategic designation with a statement of fact," he said finally, his voice a low, steady vow. "I am not asking you to be my fiancée, Elara. I am asking you to be my partner. In business, in design, in everything, if that is a future you would be interested in building." It was the most Julian Thorne proposal imaginable. It was not about passion or romance in the traditional sense. It was about partnership, about a merger of intellects and souls. It was about building something together, something strong and lasting and true. It was everything she had ever wanted, offered by the one man who had understood her from the very beginning. She didn't need to think about it. Why? The answer was already there, a solid, unshakable part of her own internal architecture. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Yes, I would like that very much." He did not sweep her into a dramatic embrace. That was not his way. Instead, he reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. The simple touch was more intimate, more meaningful than any kiss. It was a promise. A contract signed, not on paper, but in the quiet understanding that passed between them. They stood there for a long time, hand in hand, looking out at the city skyline. It was no longer just his city. It was theirs. A canvas waiting for their designs. The past was a demolished building, its rubble cleared away. The future was an empty lot, a foundation ready to be poured. And together, they were the architects. They would build something magnificent, something that would last, something that would let the light in. The kind of silence that had settled between them was not an absence, it was a home,